Right, let me tell you something that's been absolutely gnawing at me for weeks now, and I'm not going to dance around it like everyone else seems to be doing. What we witnessed at Westminster Abbey wasn't just some routine royal blessing. It was a bloody coup, plain and simple, dressed up in ermine, an ancient ritual, so we'd all nod along like obedient subjects. I was watching it live, sitting there with my coffee, thinking this was going to be another standard Church of England affair, you know, the sort, bit of incense, some Latin nobody understands, everyone files out for tea. But then the Archbishop of Canterbury opened his mouth and suddenly the temperature in that abbey dropped about 10 degrees. He wasn't blessing King Charles. He was essentially reading him his last rites while the man was still breathing up at Sandringham. And there she was, Catherine, standing there in that perfectly tailored coat, looking every inch the part she's apparently been rehearsing for years. Now, I've got nothing against Kate. Let me be clear about that. She's conducted herself with remarkable grace through some genuinely difficult circumstances. But what I witnessed that day wasn't grace. It was a carefully choreographed takeover, and Princess Anne was the stage manager. Anne walks forward with this crown, right? Custom, made by some jeweler the royals have been using since before America was even a country. Rubies, sapphires, diamonds, allegedly, from the Queen's personal stash. 2 versions of the thing, apparently. 1 heavy number locked up in the tower for the serious occasions, and this lighter model for, well, exactly what we saw. A practice run, a dress rehearsal. Call it what you want, but don't call it a blessing. The moment that crown touched Catherine's head, everything changed. You could see it in the faces of everyone in that abbey. Senior royals looking at each other like they'd just witnessed something they weren't quite prepared for, and the British public, we ate it up. We always do, don't we? Give us a bit of pageantry, wave a flag, play the national anthem, and we'll accept absolutely anything. Within hours, they were at Windsor. William and Catherine, now apparently operating as if they'd already had their coronation. The crowds were massive. People had made their own badges, for heaven's sake. For the future, William and Catherine, not God Save the King, not Long Live Charles, the future, as if the present didn't matter anymore, as if we'd all collectively agreed to skip ahead a chapter because the current one was taking too long. And where was Camilla during all this? Tucked away at her house in the countryside, allegedly doing some private reflection. Private reflection? The woman had just watched her stepdaughter-in-law essentially try on her crown while her husband recovered from whatever medical situation they're still being cagey about. I'd be doing more than privately reflecting, I can tell you that much. Here's what really bothers me about this whole thing. The palace issued these careful statements saying this wasn't a regency, just co-stewardship, they called it. Co-stewardship. What does that even mean? Either you're running the show or you're not. Either Charles is king or he isn't. But apparently we're now in some grey area where William and Catherine are doing all the king and queen bits without technically being king and queen. It's constitutional gymnastics and it's bloody dishonest. The spin machine went into overdrive immediately. Social media exploded with people praising Catherine, praising Anne, going on about a return to duty-led monarchy. A poll came out showing 84% support. 84% for what exactly? For sidelining a sitting monarch who'd waited his entire life for the job. Charles had been king for all of 2 years, and we were already moving on to the next act. Catherine's approval ratings shot through the roof. Highest since 2022, they said. CNN ran that image of her bowing to Princess Anne on a loop, calling it the defining royal image of the decade. The defining image, not Charles's coronation, not anything he'd done, just Catherine accepting a crown she technically shouldn't be wearing yet. Then came that moment at Windsor that evening. William placing flowers at some memorial oak they dedicated to Charles. Charles! The man wasn't dead, for God's sake. He was recovering at Sandringham, probably watching all this unfold on television, realizing his own son and daughter-in-law had essentially redecorated while he was in hospital. Look, I understand the practical arguments. Charles isn't well. The monarchy needs continuity. William and Catherine represent the future. They're younger, more relatable, better with the modern media landscape. I get all that. But there's something deeply troubling about how this all unfolded. No announcement, no explanation, no real acknowledgement that we were witnessing a fundamental shift in how the British monarchy operates. They sold us a blessing and delivered a transfer of power. They told us it was tradition and gave us revolution. And we all just accepted it because Catherine smiled warmly and William looked suitably serious and Anne stood there like some ancient guardian of royal protocol, nodding her approval. The monarchy hadn't waited for a coronation to change, they said afterward. It had already moved on. Well, yes, quite. And the country moved with it because we weren't given much choice, were we? The decision had already been made. The pieces had already been moved around the board. We were just watching the end game play out. So what sparked this silent transfer of power? Was it duty? Was it destiny? Or was it simply that a younger generation looked at an older one and decided they couldn't wait any longer? I know what I think. This was calculated, this was planned, and this was executed with the kind of precision that would make Machiavelli proud. The crown didn't quietly change hands. It was taken politely and properly, but taken nonetheless. Now, if you thought what happened at Westminster was dramatic, what unfolded over the following weeks was absolutely extraordinary. And by extraordinary, I mean deeply unsettling if you care even remotely about constitutional propriety and basic human decency. Camilla disappeared. Not literally, obviously, but she might as well have done. The woman who'd spent decades clawing her way from public enemy number one to Queen Consort was suddenly nowhere to be seen. They fed us lines about her supporting Charles, taking time for reflection, focusing on private matters. Load of rubbish. She'd been sidelined, pure and simple, and everyone knew it. I've got sources, right? People who actually know what goes on behind those palace walls. And what they told me was chilling. Camilla was watching all of this happen from her house, seeing Catherine on every front page, watching Princess Anne cement this new order, and she felt completely powerless. One person close to her said she was moved by Anne's words, but shaken by what followed. Shaken. That's the word they used. The woman realized history was being written, and she wasn't even getting a footnote. Meanwhile, back at Buckingham Palace, the machinery was being completely rewired. Communication teams that used to report to both Buckingham Palace and Clarence House suddenly found themselves answering only to Kensington Palace, William and Catherine's office. The office of two people who weren't even monarch and consort yet. Some called it temporary restructuring. Constitutional experts I spoke to called it something else entirely. A bloodless coup in slow motion. And Charles? Poor Charles was up at Sandringham, supposedly resting under medical supervision, approving all these changes with Princess Anne whispering in his ear. One source told me Anne looked him in the eye and said, "You can rest, Charles, they're ready." Think about that for a moment. Your sister telling you that you can rest because the next generation is ready to take over, that's not reassurance. That's retirement being packaged as relief. Catherine wasted absolutely no time. Within 48 hours of that blessing, she was hosting Commonwealth Youth Ambassadors at Kensington Palace. No crowns, no ceremony, just Catherine playing the role she'd apparently been preparing for all along. The international press went wild for it. British newspapers praised her calm authority. Overseas outlets talked about the monarchy regaining moral clarity. Moral clarity. As if the previous 70 years under Elizabeth and the brief Charles era had been morally murky. But here's where it gets really interesting. Camilla's private secretary resigned, just quit, days after the blessing. They claimed it was restructuring, but we all know what that means. When the boss loses power, the staff jumps ship. People who've been loyal to Clarence House for years were suddenly being reassigned to Kensington. One former aide described the whole thing as disorienting, like the ground was moving beneath everyone's feet. Well, yes, because it was the entire foundation of the monarchy was shifting and nobody was being honest about it. Princess Anne became the enforcer through all of this. She visited Charles twice that week, carrying updates, reinforcing unity, making sure her brother understood this was happening, whether he liked it or not. When someone asked her if these changes were permanent, she said something brilliantly, Anne. The Crown doesn't wait for comfort, it waits for courage. Absolutely perfect soundbite. Dominated the headlines, made Camilla's silence look even more deafening by comparison. Then historians started using a phrase that should have alarmed everyone: dual monarchy. They were talking about a dual monarchy in practice, if not in name. William chairing Privy Council briefings. Catherine leading state-facing engagements. Two people sharing power that constitutionally belonged to one. Unprecedented, they said, but not impossible. Well, neither is abolishing the monarchy entirely, but we don't do it because we have rules and traditions and a constitution, vague as it might be. The turning point came with that private meeting at Camilla's house. William went to see his stepmother, and by all accounts, it was brutal in its politeness. He essentially told her she'd always have a place in the family, but that the country wanted renewal. Renewal. What a word. What he meant was that the country wanted her gone from any position of influence, and there was nothing she could do about it. Camilla's response was remarkable, actually. She told him that renewal comes for everyone and never asked permission. When fragments of that conversation leaked to the Telegraph, people tried to spin it as bitterness, but I read it differently. That was a woman who'd been around the block, who understood exactly how power works, delivering a warning. She was saying that what happened to her would eventually happen to them too. Time comes for everyone. The crown doesn't belong to anyone forever. But William and Catherine weren't listening to warnings. They were too busy planning the Commonwealth Youth Forum, which Catherine insisted would focus on young voices rather than royal pageantry. Noble sentiment, perhaps, but also convenient when you're trying to rebrand a 1,000-year-old institution as modern and accessible. She commissioned this film, all young people from across the Commonwealth telling their stories, ending with a line about leadership being about who stands beside you, not above you. Beautiful, moving. Absolute genius marketing. The film went viral. Newspapers in Africa and the Caribbean called it a People's Crown moment. Even Charles apparently watched it and got emotional, saying Catherine understood what he tried to begin. What he tried to begin? The man was talking about himself in the past tense while still technically being king. It was tragic, frankly. Then came the real kicker. The Privy Council started instructing diplomats to address Catherine as Her Majesty the Queen Consort Designate. Not Princess, not future Queen, Queen Consort Designate. They were giving her the title before any coronation had taken place. Royal commentators called it a quiet crowning. I call it what it was. They decided to make her queen and were just waiting for the paperwork to catch up. Anne dismissed any surprise about the speed of it all, said history rarely announces itself, it just moves forward when the moment arrives. Easy for her to say, she wasn't the one being pushed aside. She wasn't Camilla, watching another woman step into the role you'd finally claimed after decades of public abuse and scandal. That meeting at Camilla's house kept echoing, though. Her words about renewal, never asking permission, became prophetic, because that's exactly what happened. Renewal arrived uninvited and unstoppable, reshaping the crown without anyone's permission. Not Charles's, not Camilla's, certainly not ours. The decision had been made in private rooms by people who decided the monarchy couldn't wait any longer for the future to arrive. So they dragged the future into the present and called it duty.